The morning sun broke through the clouds over the Pacific Ocean on March 15, 1943. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen sat behind his 50 caliber machine gun inside the waist section of a B-17 flying fortress bomber called Desert Rose. His hands were sweating inside his leather gloves. The metal of the gun felt cold despite the tropical heat. Around him, 11 other bombers flew in tight formation, heading toward a Japanese supply base on a small island. Mike had been in the Pacific Theater for 4 months now. He had flown 16 missions, and each one felt like dancing with death. The B-17 was called a flying fortress because it had so many guns. 13 machine guns pointed in every direction. The idea was simple. Bombers could defend themselves against enemy fighters. But the reality was very different. Mike had fired thousands of rounds at enemy planes. He had hit maybe 3 or 4. The Japanese Zero fighters were fast, nimble, and deadly. The radio crackled. Bogies at 2 o'clock high. Here they come. Mike's heart jumped. He swung his gun toward the right side of the plane and looked up. 6 Japanese Zero fighters dove toward the formation like hawks attacking pigeons. Their wings sparkled with muzzle flashes as they opened fire. Bullets punched through the thin aluminum skin of bombers. One B-17 on the left side of the formation started trailing black smoke. Mike tracked the lead Zero with his gun sight. The fighter was coming fast, maybe 300 miles per hour. Mike did exactly what his training taught him. He aimed ahead of the Zero, leading the target just like shooting ducks or clay pigeons. He squeezed the trigger. The gun roared and shook his entire body. Spent brass casings bounced on the floor. His tracer rounds arced through the sky in a beautiful curve. They missed. The Zero flashed past, so close Mike could see the red circle on its wings. "Damn it!" Mike shouted. His voice was lost in the thunder of gunfire from all around the plane. Another Zero came from below, climbing fast. Mike swung his gun down and led the target again. He fired a long burst. The tracers showed him where his bullets went. They passed behind the Zero by what looked like just a few feet. Another miss. The Zero's cannon fire stitched a line of holes across the bottom of Desert Rose. The plane shuddered. Mike heard someone screaming in the tail section. The air battle lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the Zeros finally broke off their attack, 3 American bombers were seriously damaged. One was losing altitude, struggling to stay in formation. Mike had fired 400 rounds. He was almost certain he had not hit a single enemy plane. The formation continued to the target, dropped their bombs, and turned for home. On the long flight back to Guadalcanal, Mike sat in silence. His arms ached from holding the heavy gun. His ears rang from the noise. But worse than the physical pain was the feeling of helplessness. He had trained for 6 months to be an aerial gunner. He practiced on ground targets and towed sleeves. His instructors said he was good. But in real combat, against real enemy fighters, he could not hit anything. Desert Rose landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal just before sunset. The ground crew counted over 60 bullet holes in the plane. The tail gunner had taken shrapnel in his leg and was carried off to the medical tent. Mike climbed out of the plane, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He saw other crews gathering, talking in low voices. Everyone had the same story. They fired. They missed. They barely survived. That night, Colonel James Harrison sat in his tent reviewing combat reports by the light of a kerosene lamp. The mosquitoes buzzed around his head, but he barely noticed them. The numbers in front of him told a grim story. In the last month, his bomber group had flown 43 missions. They had lost 18 bombers, either shot down or damaged beyond repair. They had claimed 31 enemy fighters destroyed, but intelligence suggested the real number was closer to 20. The mathematics was brutal. For every 2 enemy fighters they shot down, they lost 3 bombers. Each bomber had 10 crew members. The cost in American lives was unbearable. Colonel Harrison was not just worried about the numbers. He was worried about morale. His gunners were well-trained, brave young men. They followed their training perfectly. They aimed ahead of fast-moving targets, compensating for speed and distance. It was basic physics, the same principle used in every kind of shooting sport. But something was wrong. The hit rate was less than 5%. Out of every 100 rounds fired at an enemy fighter, fewer than 5 hit their target. Across the Pacific, the same problem existed on every American bomber base. In Europe, B-17 and B-24 crews faced German fighters, and had the same terrible results. The Army Air Corps had built bombers covered in guns, but the guns were not stopping enemy fighters. Bomber crews felt like targets in a shooting gallery, unable to defend themselves effectively. What Colonel Harrison did not know, what nobody in command knew, was that one crew at his own base had figured out something different. A single bomber crew called Lucky Strike had survived 22 missions with minimal damage. Their gunners had an unusually high hit rate. When asked about their success, the crew mumbled about luck and good teamwork. Their lead gunner, a quiet farm boy from Iowa named Bill Hawkins, said very little to anyone. But Bill Hawkins knew something. Something his father taught him on cold winter mornings, hunting ducks on frozen Iowa lakes. Something that contradicted everything the Army taught in gunnery school. He knew that at extreme speeds, when two objects rushed toward each other at a combined rate of 400 or 500 miles per hour, the old rules of leading a target did not work the same way. Bill Hawkins knew you had to aim differently. Sometimes you aimed where the target was, not where it was going. Sometimes you even aimed slightly behind. It seemed crazy. It went against all training. But Bill had tested it in combat, and it worked. He hit targets other gunners missed. He kept his crew alive. Colonel Harrison would eventually learn this secret. The entire Air Corps would learn it. The change would save thousands of lives and alter the course of the air war. But on this night, as Mike Chun cleaned his gun and wondered if he would survive his next mission, as Colonel Harrison stared at casualty reports and felt the weight of command, as Bill Hawkins lay in his bunk, silently counting the rivets in the ceiling, nobody knew that everything was about to change. The answer was already there. It just needed to be discovered. Colonel James Harrison woke up at 5 in the morning on March 18, 1943. He had barely slept. The casualty reports kept running through his mind like a nightmare he could not escape. 18 bombers lost in 1 month. 180 young men dead or missing. The numbers haunted him. He splashed water on his face from a metal basin and looked at himself in a cracked mirror. His eyes had dark circles under them. He was 42 years old, but felt ancient. He had made a decision during the sleepless night. He needed to understand why one crew, Lucky Strike, survived when so many others did not. Some officers believed in luck. Harrison believed in patterns. There had to be a reason that at 6 in the morning, Harrison walked across the airfield to where Lucky Strike was being prepared for a mission. The ground crew was loading ammunition belts and checking the engines. The bomber's pilot, Lieutenant James Parker, saw the colonel approaching and saluted. Parker was a lanky kid from Texas with an easy smile, but his eyes showed the stress of too many combat missions. "Colonel, sir, what brings you out here so early?" "I am flying with you today, Lieutenant." As an observer, Parker's smile faded. Having a colonel aboard was unusual and made everyone nervous. But orders were orders. "Yes, sir. We will make room for you." Harrison climbed into the bomber and positioned himself near the top turret where Bill Hawkins operated his twin 50 caliber guns. Hawkins was 23 years old, medium height, with sandy brown hair and steady hands. He barely acknowledged the colonel's presence, focused entirely on his pre-flight checks. Harrison watched him carefully. Nothing seemed unusual. Hawkins moved with quiet efficiency, checking ammunition feeds, testing gun movement, adjusting his sight. The mission was to hit a Japanese airfield on Bougainville Island. 12 bombers took off in formation and headed northwest. The flight took 2 hours. Harrison spent the time watching Hawkins and the other gunners. They were alert, scanning the sky constantly, ready for the enemy fighters that always came. The radio burst to life. "Bandits. 10 o'clock level." Harrison looked out and saw them. 8 Japanese Zero fighters, rising from below like sharks coming up from deep water. The Zeros were beautiful planes in a deadly way, lightweight, agile, fast. They could turn inside any American plane. Their pilots were experienced and aggressive. The Americans called them the most dangerous fighter in the Pacific. The Zeros split into 2 groups. 4 came at the formation head-on. 4 swept around to attack from the side. This was a coordinated attack by skilled pilots. Harrison felt his stomach tighten with fear. He was a desk officer now, not used to combat anymore. The sound of machine guns erupted all around the bomber. Spent shell casings clattered on the metal floor. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Harrison forced himself to focus on Bill Hawkins. The other gunners in the formation were firing, their tracers reaching out like fingers trying to swat flies. Most of the shots missed. The Zeros danced around the streams of bullets, incredibly fast, impossibly nimble. But then Hawkins opened fire, and Harrison saw something that made no sense. Hawkins was not leading the targets. Every other gunner aimed ahead of the enemy planes, compensating for their speed. Hawkins aimed directly at them. Sometimes he even seemed to aim behind them. Harrison's first thought was that the young man had frozen or panicked. But Hawkins looked completely calm. His movements were smooth and deliberate, and his tracers were hitting a Zero that was attacking head-on, suddenly sprouted smoke from its engine. The pilot pulled up sharply and veered away. Another Zero came from the side, guns blazing. Hawkins tracked it, fired a short burst, and pieces flew off the Zero's wing. The Japanese plane rolled away, trailing debris. The battle lasted 6 minutes. When the Zeros broke off, 2 of them were trailing smoke and 1 appeared to be seriously damaged. Lucky Strike had barely been hit. Other bombers in the formation had taken heavy damage. One bomber on the far left was struggling with 1 engine dead. After they dropped their bombs and turned for home, Harrison made his way forward to where Hawkins sat in his turret. The young gunner was reloading ammunition belts, his movements mechanical and tired. "Sergeant Hawkins, I need to talk to you." Hawkins looked up, surprised. "Yes, sir? What you did back there? How you aimed? That is not what they teach in gunnery school." Hawkins went very still. He looked worried, like a student caught breaking the rules. "No, sir. It is not. Explain it to me." Hawkins was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, back home in Iowa, my father taught me to hunt ducks. We would go out before dawn in the winter. The ducks fly fast, maybe 40 or 50 miles per hour. My father taught me to lead them, aim ahead, the way the Army teaches. But one day we were hunting in a strong wind. The ducks were flying with the wind, going really fast, and I kept missing. My father told me something strange. He said when things are moving that fast, your eyes and your instincts lie to you. He said sometimes you have to aim where they are, not where they are going." Harrison listened intently. Hawkins continued, "When I got here and started flying combat missions, I noticed the same thing. The Zeros come at us so fast. The closing speed is maybe 400 miles per hour or more. When I aimed ahead like training taught me, I missed. So I started aiming differently. Less lead. Sometimes no lead at all. Sometimes even a little behind. And I started hitting them. That goes against all the training," Harrison said. "Yes, sir. I know. I thought I would get in trouble, so I did not tell anyone." Harrison looked at the young sergeant for a long moment. Here was a farm boy from Iowa with no advanced education, who had figured out something that all the experts and training officers had missed. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was clear. Hawkins hit targets. Other gunners did not. "Hawkins, you are not in trouble. But I need you to explain this to some other people. Can you do that?" "I will try, sir." Back at Guadalcanal, Harrison immediately called a meeting with his senior officers and the chief gunnery instructor, Captain Ted Morrison. Morrison was a career officer who had helped write the gunnery training manual. He was proud of his expertise and did not like being questioned. Harrison brought Hawkins in and asked him to explain his technique. Hawkins did his best, using his hands to show how he aimed, trying to describe the physics without having the technical words for it. Morrison listened with increasing irritation. "This is nonsense," Morrison said flatly. "The mathematics of ballistics are clear. You must lead a moving target. This is basic physics taught in every military in the world. But the results suggest otherwise," Harrison argued. "One gunner having lucky hits does not overturn established doctrine," Morrison shot back. The argument went on for an hour. Other officers were divided. Some thought Hawkins might be onto something. Others agreed with Morrison that this was just luck or coincidence. Harrison finally made a decision. "We will test this. Quietly. I want 10 volunteer gunners trained in Hawkins's method. We will compare their results to 10 gunners using standard technique. 2 weeks. Then we will know." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue more, but held his tongue. "Yes, sir. But I am confident the test will prove the established methods correct." That night, Mike Chun heard rumors about a new aiming technique. He was desperate to learn more. His crew had another mission scheduled in 3 days. He found Bill Hawkins sitting alone near the airstrip after dark, watching the stars. "Sergeant Hawkins, can we talk?" Hawkins looked up, surprised. Mike sat down next to him without waiting for an answer. "I heard you shoot different than the rest of us. I need to know how. I need to bring my crew home alive." Hawkins studied Mike's face and saw the desperation there. The fear. The determination. He made a decision. Okay, I will show you. But you have to forget everything you learned in training school. Can you do that? Mike Chen nodded. I will do whatever it takes. The lesson began there, in the darkness, two young men trying to understand the physics of death and survival at 500 miles per hour. Bill Hawkins sat in the dirt next to Mike Chen, drawing diagrams with a stick under the Pacific stars. The air was hot and humid, filled with the sound of insects and distant ocean waves. Other airmen slept in their tents, exhausted from the day's mission. But Mike could not sleep. He needed to understand. His life depended on it. Look, Hawkins said, scratching lines in the dirt. When you are standing still on the ground shooting at a moving duck, you lead the target. That makes sense. The duck is moving, you are not. But in a bomber, you are moving too. Fast. Maybe 180 miles per hour. Your bullets leave the gun already moving at that speed, plus the speed of the bullet itself. Mike stared at the diagram. I do not understand. We learned about this in training. They called it ballistics. They taught you part of it, but not all of it. Hawkins drew another line. When a zero comes at you head-on, you are both moving toward each other. The closing speed is not just his speed. It is his speed plus your speed. Maybe 400 miles per hour total. At that speed, the time between when you fire and when the bullets get there is so short that leading the target makes you miss. You overcorrect. Mike shook his head, frustrated. This goes against everything they taught us. I know. That is why nobody believes it. But I have tested it in combat. It works. They talked for 2 more hours. Hawkins explained how to judge closing speed, how to trust your instincts differently, how to aim based on what you see, not what you learned. Mike listened and tried to understand. It felt like learning to walk all over again after spending your whole life doing it one way. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison's test program was causing problems. Captain Morrison, the gunnery instructor, selected 10 volunteers, but chose men he thought would fail. He wanted to prove Hawkins wrong. The training sessions were tense. Morrison taught the new technique, but with obvious doubt in his voice. Some gunners picked it up quickly. Others struggled, their old training too deeply burned into their muscle memory. Sergeant Tommy O'Brien from Boston was one of the strugglers. He had flown 12 missions and never scored a confirmed hit. He wanted desperately to learn the new way, but his hands would not cooperate. Every time he aimed at a target, his instincts screamed at him to lead more. He could not override years of training in just a few practice sessions. But a gunner named Danny Rodriguez from Texas seemed born for the new technique. He was young, only 19, and had less ingrained training to unlearn. When Hawkins explained the concept, something clicked in Rodriguez's mind. During practice runs with targets towed by other planes, Rodriguez started hitting consistently. His confidence grew with each successful shot. The test period was supposed to last 2 weeks. But the war did not stop for tests. Missions continued. Men died. On March 25, 1943, 8 days into the test, a major bombing raid was scheduled against the Japanese base at Rabaul. This was one of the most heavily defended targets in the Pacific. The Japanese had over 100 fighters stationed there. Every raid on Rabaul was a desperate battle. 24 American bombers would go. 12 of the bombers had gunners trained in the new technique. 12 had gunners using standard methods. The test was about to get very real. Mike Chen's crew, Desert Rose, was assigned to the mission. Mike had practiced the new aiming method every chance he got. He dry-fired his gun hundreds of times, trying to retrain his reflexes. But he was terrified. What if the new method was wrong? What if he got his crew killed by not using proven techniques? The night before the mission, he barely slept. At dawn on March 26th, the bombers took off. The flight to Rabaul took 3 hours. The crews flew in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. Mike stood at his waist gun position, hands shaking slightly. He prayed. He thought about his family in San Francisco, his mother's face, his little sister's laugh. He wondered if he would ever see them again. The formation approached Rabaul at 10,000 feet. The island appeared through the clouds, and immediately the sky filled with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese knew they were coming. The bombers pushed through the flak, the explosions rocking the planes. Then the radio crackled with the words every crew dreaded. Bandits. 12 o'clock high. Lots of them. Japanese fighters poured out of the clouds above like a waterfall of death. Mike counted at least 30 zeros, more than he had ever seen at once. His heart hammered in his chest. This was going to be bad. The Zeros dove toward the bomber formation, their wings sparkling with machine gun and cannon fire. The air exploded with noise. Every gun on every bomber opened fire at once. The sky filled with tracer rounds, crisscrossing streams of light, desperately trying to stop the attacking fighters. Mike swung his gun toward a Zero coming from the right side. His old training screamed at him to lead the target, aim ahead. But he forced himself to remember Hawkins's words. Trust what you see. Aim with less lead. He tracked the Zero, put his sight directly on it, and fired. His tracers reached out, and the Zero flew right through them. Hits sparkled on the enemy's wing. The Zero's canopy shattered. The plane rolled away, smoke pouring from its engine. Mike had hit it. He had actually hit it. I got him, Mike shouted. Nobody heard him over the thunder of battle. All around the formation, something different was happening. The gunners trained in the new method were hitting targets more consistently. Rodriguez on another bomber scored 2 hits in 30 seconds. Another gunner using the new technique set a Zero on fire. The Japanese pilots, expecting to easily dodge American fire like always, suddenly found bullets connecting. Several Zeros pulled away with damage, their pilots shocked. But the gunners using old techniques struggled just like always. Tommy O'Brien, still unable to break his old habits under combat pressure, fired long bursts that missed completely. His frustration nearly brought him to tears. Other gunners using standard methods had the same experience. Their tracers looked good but passed harmlessly behind or in front of the enemy planes. The battle raged for 12 minutes. Zeros attacked from every angle. One bomber on the edge of the formation took heavy hits and began losing altitude, smoke trailing from 2 engines. The crew radioed that they were heading for the nearest friendly island. Another bomber had its tail section shot up, the tail gunner killed instantly. But compared to previous WWII missions, the damage was lighter. More Zeros were retreating with battle damage than usual. Japanese pilots were visibly more cautious, respecting the American defensive fire in a way they had not before. The psychological impact was as important as the physical hits. For the first time, the hunters felt like they could become the hunted. The formation reached the target and dropped their bombs. Explosions rippled across the Japanese airfield below. Fuel dumps erupted in massive fireballs. Then the bombers turned for home, and the Zeros attacked again during the withdrawal. This was the most dangerous part. Damaged bombers, low on ammunition, trying to reach safety. Mike fired until his gun barrel glowed red-hot. He hit another Zero, saw pieces fly off its tail. The fighter spun away out of control. All around him, gunners fought desperately. Rodriguez got another kill. A gunner named Peterson hit a Zero that exploded in a ball of fire. The bomber crews were fighting back effectively for the first time. When the formation finally escaped the Zeros and headed out over open ocean, the crews took stock. 2 bombers were badly damaged, but still flying. 22 bombers were returning home. That was much better than previous WWII missions, which typically lost 4 or 5 bombers. The intelligence officers would later count 14 confirmed Zero kills, with at least 9 more damaged. Previous comparable missions averaged 6 kills with twice the losses. Back at Guadalcanal, Colonel Harrison reviewed the preliminary combat reports with barely contained excitement. The numbers were undeniable. The gunners using Hawkins's technique had triple the hit rate of those using standard methods. Captain Morrison reviewed the same reports with a sick feeling in his stomach. Everything he had taught for years was wrong. That evening, Morrison approached Colonel Harrison privately. "Sir, I need to apologize. The test results are clear. Sergeant Hawkins is correct. We have been teaching gunners the wrong method." Harrison respected Morrison for admitting it. "The important thing now is fixing it. We need to retrain everyone immediately." Word spread through the base like wildfire. Gunners crowded around Hawkins, asking questions, wanting to learn. Mike Chin found Hawkins that evening and shook his hand firmly. "You saved my life today. Thank you." Hawkins looked embarrassed. "I just aimed different. That is all." But it was not just aiming different. It was being willing to question authority, to trust experience over doctrine, to think independently. Those qualities would change the course of the air war. The change was coming, and more American boys would go home alive because of it. The news from Guadalcanal reached Major General Frank Bradley at Pacific Air Command Headquarters in Hawaii 3 days after the Rebel mission. He sat in his office overlooking Pearl Harbor, reading Colonel Harrison's detailed report 3 times. The statistics were remarkable. 14 confirmed enemy fighters destroyed with minimal bomber losses. The gunners using the new technique had hit rates that should not have been possible. Bradley was a careful man. He had been in the military for 23 years and had seen plenty of miracle solutions that turned out to be nothing. But the numbers in front of him were hard to ignore. He picked up his phone and called the training command back in Nevada. "This is General Bradley. I need to speak with Colonel Winters immediately." Colonel Winters ran the aerial gunnery school where every American aerial gunner learned his trade. He was not happy to receive the call. For 30 minutes, Bradley explained the situation. Winters grew increasingly defensive. "General, our training methods are based on solid physics and years of experience. One successful mission does not prove anything. There are too many variables in combat. Weather, pilot skill, enemy tactics. I would need to see much more evidence before considering any changes to our curriculum." Bradley felt his patience wearing thin. "Colonel, we are losing bombers and crews at an unsustainable rate. If there is even a chance this new method works, we need to pursue it aggressively. With respect, sir, changing training doctrine based on insufficient evidence could make things worse, not better." The conversation ended with no agreement. Bradley hung up feeling frustrated. The military bureaucracy moved slowly, especially when it meant admitting mistakes. But men were dying while the bureaucrats debated. He made a command decision. He would implement the new training method across all Pacific Theater bomber groups immediately. If it failed, his career would be over. If it succeeded, Training Command would eventually have to adopt it everywhere. Bradley sent urgent orders to Guadalcanal. Colonel Harrison was to establish an intensive training program for all bomber gunners in the Pacific. Bill Hawkins was pulled from combat duty and promoted to technical sergeant. His new job was teaching other gunners his technique. Hawkins was terrified. He was a farm boy who barely finished high school. Now he had to stand in front of experienced combat veterans and tell them their training was wrong. The training facility was set up in a clearing near Henderson Field. On April 2, 1943, Hawkins stood before his first class of 30 gunners. They sat on wooden benches in the hot sun, many of them looking skeptical or annoyed. These were men who had survived multiple combat missions. They did not appreciate being told they had been doing things wrong. Hawkins cleared his throat nervously. "I know this seems strange. I am not a teacher. I am just a gunner like all of you. But I learned something that works, and I want to share it." He started with his father's duck hunting story. Some of the men laughed. Others looked insulted. A veteran gunner named Phillips stood up. "Kid, I have flown 26 missions. I have been trained by the best instructors in the Air Corps. You are telling me a duck hunting story is going to save my life." Hawkins met his eyes. "I am telling you what works in combat. You can listen or not. That is your choice." Phillips sat down, still skeptical but willing to hear more. Mike Chin sat in the front row, helping demonstrate the technique he had learned. Together, they explained the physics in simple terms. Closing speed, relative velocity, the way a bullet inherits the speed of the plane that fires it. They used models, hand gestures, anything that might help the concept click. Over the next 2 weeks, hundreds of gunners went through the training. Some adapted quickly. Others struggled. A few never got it and went back to their old methods. But overall, the results were promising. Practice exercises showed improved hit rates. More importantly, the gunners' confidence was growing. They felt like they had a real defense against enemy fighters instead of just spraying bullets and hoping. On April 15th, the new training was put to its biggest test yet. A massive raid was planned against the Japanese naval base at Shortland Island. 36 bombers would participate, the largest American bombing raid in the Pacific so far. Intelligence reported at least 50 Japanese fighters based nearby. This would be the most intense air battle many of the crews had ever experienced. Mike Chin's crew was part of the raid. As Desert Rose lifted off the runway at dawn, Mike felt a strange mixture of fear and confidence. He had trained hard in the new technique. He had seen it work. But this was going to be the real test. 36 bombers meant the Japanese would throw everything they had at them. The formation flew north for 4 hours. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, blue and empty and indifferent to the war being fought above it. Mike stood at his gun position, checking and rechecking his ammunition. His hands were steadier than they used to be. He knew what to do now. That knowledge helped with the fear, though it never made the fear go away completely. The radio came alive. Approaching target. Expect heavy resistance. Minutes later, the island appeared on the horizon, and then the enemy fighters rose to meet them. Not 50, more like 70. The sky filled with Japanese planes, Zeros, some older models, even a few new fighters the Americans had not seen before. They came from every direction at once, a coordinated swarm designed to overwhelm the bomber formation. The battle erupted with terrifying intensity. Every gun on every bomber opened fire simultaneously. The noise was like being inside a thunderstorm made of metal. Mike tracked a Zero diving from above, put his sight directly on the target with minimal lead, and fired. The Zero took hits along its fuselage and veered away, trailing smoke. Another Zero came from the side. Mike swung his gun, aimed, fired. More hits. The enemy plane rolled away, its wing damaged. All around the formation, the new technique was proving its worth. Rodriguez, now one of the squadron's best gunners, was hitting everything he aimed at. He scored 3 confirmed kills in the first 5 minutes of combat. Phillips, the skeptical veteran, found that the new method finally let him hit targets consistently. He got 2 kills and damaged another. Tommy O'Brien, who had struggled so much, finally had his breakthrough moment under fire. When he stopped trying to lead and just aimed where his instincts told him, he hit a Zero in the engine. The enemy plane caught fire and went down. The Japanese pilots were confused and frustrated. American bombers were supposed to be easy targets. Their defensive fire was supposed to be inaccurate and ineffective. But today, Zeros were taking heavy damage. Several pilots broke off their attacks and retreated, unwilling to press through the surprisingly deadly defensive fire. This had never happened before. The Americans were supposed to be the ones retreating. The bombers reached the target and dropped their payloads. The Japanese naval facilities below erupted in explosions. Fuel tanks burst into massive fireballs. Supply buildings collapsed. The destruction was extensive. Then the formation turned for home, and the battle continued as a crippled bomber with 2 engines out fell behind the formation. Mike's plane and 3 others dropped back to protect it. The Japanese fighters focused on the stragglers, seeing an opportunity. This was the most dangerous moment. The gunners fired constantly, their barrels glowing hot. Mike went through ammunition belt after ammunition belt. His shoulder ached from the gun's recoil. Sweat poured down his face. But he kept firing, kept hitting. A Zero exploded from a lucky shot through its fuel tank. Another limped away with half its tail shot off. The crippled bomber made it to cloud cover. All the planes survived to reach base. When they landed back at Guadalcanal, the intelligence officers counted the results. 23 confirmed enemy fighters destroyed. At least 15 more damaged. Only 2 American bombers seriously damaged, both reparable. 0 losses. It was an unprecedented success. General Bradley received the report and immediately sent it to Washington. The War Department could no longer ignore the evidence. Training Command was ordered to integrate the new method into all gunnery school curriculum immediately. Colonel Winters in Nevada had to eat his words and admit the new technique worked. Bill Hawkins was summoned to Washington to help rewrite the training manuals. He was terrified of leaving the Pacific and going to the nation's capital, but orders were orders. Before he left, dozens of gunners came to thank him personally. Mike Chin shook his hand firmly. You saved hundreds of lives. Maybe thousands. You should be proud. Hawkins looked embarrassed, the way he always did when people praised him. I just aimed different. That is all. But it was so much more than that. It was being willing to question, to observe, to trust experience over authority. Those qualities had changed everything. The tide of the air war was shifting. American bombers were no longer helpless targets. They were becoming dangerous adversaries. Enemy pilots now approached with caution and respect. The change that started with duck hunting in Iowa had spread across the Pacific and would soon reach every combat theater in the world. And young men like Mike Chun, Tommy O'Brien, and Danny Rodriguez would survive to see the wars end and return home, all because one quiet farm boy dared to aim differently. 6 months passed. It was now October 1943. Bill Hawkins sat in the back of a military transport plane heading back to the Pacific from Washington. He wore his dress uniform with new sergeant stripes and several medals he did not think he deserved. For 3 months, he had worked with training officers, physicists, and military strategists, translating his instinctive knowledge into formal doctrine. The new gunnery manual was being printed. Thousands of copies would be distributed to every air base in the world. The impact of the new aiming technique had spread far beyond Guadalcanal. In Europe, B-17 and B-24 crews bombing Germany now used the same method against Luftwaffe fighters. The results were equally dramatic. Bomber losses over Germany dropped by 35% in just 2 months. German pilots reported increased difficulty attacking American formations. Some German commanders thought the Americans had developed a new secret weapon. They had, in a way. Knowledge was the most powerful weapon. When Hawkins's plane landed at the new American base in the Philippines, he was assigned to a fresh bomber crew. Combat duty again. He was relieved. He was a gunner, not a teacher or a celebrity. He just wanted to do his job and survive. On his first mission back, flying over Japanese-held islands, enemy fighters attacked, and Hawkins fell into his familiar rhythm. Track, judge closing speed, aim with minimal lead, fire. 2 Zeros took damage and retreated. Some things never changed. He was still good at what he did. Meanwhile, across the Pacific and in Europe, the transformation continued. American bomber crews who once felt helpless now had confidence. Gunner training schools taught the new method from day one. Fresh crews arriving at combat bases already knew how to aim effectively. The survival rate of bomber crews improved month by month. The statistics told a clear story. In early 1943, the average bomber crew had a 50% chance of completing their required 25 missions. By early 1944, that number had risen to 70%. The new gunnery technique was not the only factor, but it was significant. Mike Chin's crew completed their 25 missions in August 1943. They had survived. All 10 crew members would go home. The night before they left Guadalcanal, Mike sought out the training field where Hawkins had taught him the new technique months earlier. He stood there alone, remembering how desperate and scared he had been. He thought about the friends he had lost, the crews that went down before the new method was discovered. Their names were carved on a memorial wall near the airstrip. Mike ran his fingers over the carved letters and said a quiet prayer for them. Danny Rodriguez, the young gunner from Texas who adapted so quickly to the new technique, stayed in the Pacific and flew 53 missions. He became one of the most successful aerial gunners of the war, with 11 confirmed kills. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force and eventually retired as a colonel. He spent his career teaching new generations of airmen, always emphasizing the importance of questioning assumptions and learning from experience. Tommy O'Brien from Boston, who struggled so much before finally getting it, completed 30 missions and went home with a chest full of medals. He returned to his job at a factory and rarely talked about the war. But sometimes, late at night in bars, he would tell the story of the farm boy from Iowa who saved his life by teaching him to aim differently. Most people did not believe the story. It sounded too simple to be true. Colonel James Harrison was promoted to brigadier general and given command of all bomber operations in the Pacific. He never forgot the lesson. Institutional knowledge can be wrong. Expertise can become rigid, and innovation sometimes comes from the least expected places. He made it policy to listen to suggestions from any rank, to test new ideas even if they seemed crazy, to never let bureaucracy prevent necessary changes. His leadership style influenced a generation of Air Force officers. Captain Ted Morrison, the training officer who initially resisted the new method, eventually became one of its strongest advocates. He rewrote the entire gunnery training program, incorporating not just the new aiming technique, but a philosophy of adaptive thinking. He taught instructors to explain the why behind techniques, not just the how. His revised curriculum remained the foundation of aerial gunnery training for decades. The war ended in August 1945. Bill Hawkins came home to his family farm in Iowa. He was 26 years old, a decorated combat veteran, a man whose innovation had saved thousands of lives. But in Iowa, he was just Bill, the farmer's son who liked to hunt ducks. He never talked much about his role in changing aerial warfare. When neighbors asked about his service, he said simply, "I was a gunner on a bomber. I did my job and came home. I was lucky. The farm welcomed him back. The same fields his father had taught him to hunt on. The same frozen lakes where he learned that at high speeds, the old rules do not always apply." He married a local girl named Mary in 1946. They had 4 children. Bill taught them all to hunt, passing down the same lessons his father taught him. None of his children knew that their father's duck hunting knowledge had changed military history. Decades later, in the 1980s, military historians finally documented the story. They analyzed combat records, interviewed survivors, traced the spread of the new gunnery technique across all combat theaters. The numbers were staggering. An estimated 8,000 American airmen survived the war because bombers with the new gunnery technique were shot down less often. Thousands of enemy aircraft were destroyed that might otherwise have survived. The strategic bombing campaign that helped win the war was made possible partly by one man's willingness to think differently. Mike Chin became a high school teacher in San Francisco. He taught history and always included a lesson about World War II. He told his students about the importance of questioning authority when evidence suggests something is wrong. He told them that intelligence and courage mean nothing without the willingness to adapt and learn. He never mentioned his own combat experience unless asked directly, but his students noticed the old framed photograph on his desk, a young Mike in his flight suit, standing in front of a B-17 bomber, smiling because he was alive. The B-17 flying fortress in the photo was named Desert Rose. It survived the war and was eventually brought back to the United States. In 1987, it was restored and put on display at the Air Force Museum in Ohio. An older Bill Hawkins visited the museum once, walking slowly through the exhibits. He stood before Desert Rose for a long time, memories flooding back. A young Air Force pilot approached him, seeing his veteran's cap. "Were you a bomber crew member, sir?" "Gunner," Bill said quietly. "Thank you for your service." Those bombers were something else, weren't they? Flying fortresses loaded with guns, but I read they had a hard time hitting enemy fighters at first. Bill smiled slightly. They figured it out eventually. I heard they changed the training methods during the war. Something about aiming differently at high speeds. Something like that, Bill said. The young pilot did not know he was talking to the man who discovered that technique. Bill did not tell him. He just thanked the pilot for his service and walked on through the museum. Just another old veteran remembering old wars. Bill Hawkins died in 2004 at the age of 85, in the same Iowa farmhouse where he grew up. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he was a World War II veteran, but gave no details. His family buried him in the small cemetery outside town. The headstone read simply, William T. Hawkins, 1918 to 2004, beloved husband, father, and veteran. But in military academies and Air Force training schools, his legacy lived on. The principle he discovered, that at extreme relative velocities, traditional aiming methods overcorrect, became fundamental doctrine. Modern computerized gun sights calculate the same factors Bill figured out by instinct and experience. Fighter pilots and gunners still learn about closing speed and relative velocity, though most do not know the story of how that knowledge was discovered. The lesson transcended aerial gunnery. Bill Hawkins' story became a case study in military innovation. How a junior enlisted man with practical experience questioned institutional wisdom. How one observer in command position was willing to listen. How evidence overcame bureaucratic resistance. How a simple change in technique had strategic consequences. Every year, new officers at the Air Force Academy hear the story. They learn that rank does not equal wisdom, that expertise can become dogma, and that the most important innovations sometimes come from the most unexpected sources. Mike Chin outlived most of his crew and many of his fellow veterans. In his final years, in the early 2000s, he was interviewed by historians documenting the Pacific Air War. He told them about Bill Hawkins, about the technique that saved his life, about the importance of being willing to learn and adapt. The interview was preserved in the National Archives. His last words on the recording were simple and profound. "We were losing the war in the air until one man had the courage to think differently. That is what saved us. Not technology, not numbers, not even bravery, though God knows we had plenty of that. What saved us was the willingness to question, to observe, to change. That is the real lesson of the war." Mike Chin died in 2009 at age 87, surrounded by family, at peace with his memories. He had lived a full life because Bill Hawkins taught him how to aim. The war was full of heroes who charged machine gun nests, who flew burning planes to safety, who endured prison camps with dignity. Bill Hawkins was a different kind of hero. He saved lives not through sacrifice, but through observation. Not through courage, but through questioning. Not through following orders, but through trusting his experience over doctrine. His story reminds us that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with ideas. That innovation comes from unexpected places. That one person with the courage to think differently can change the course of history. And that the answer to complex problems is sometimes simpler than anyone imagined. You just have to be willing to see it. The genius was not in the complexity. It was in the courage to aim differently.